Hi, everybody. I'm Mike McCrory, and this is Would You Make It? A couple of years ago, I made a travel chessboard, and as an added precaution, I glued up an extra set of chessboard squares to serve as a backup because there were a lot of things that could have gone wrong with that build. But it turned out I didn't need to use them. So a couple of months ago, I met a guy in an art gallery who asked me if I could make a chessboard for his son's upcoming 16th birthday, and I thought this would be a perfect opportunity to make use of these squares. The difference with this build is I'm going to make a box for the chess pieces that sits underneath, and the folded chessboard will serve as the top of the box. So let's get started. Since the playing field is already made, the only thing I need is a couple of lengths of sapele that are about 4 feet long. One piece will be for the frame, and the other piece will be for the sides of the box. This is 10-quarter sapele, so I can resaw on the bandsaw to get the thicknesses I need for the frame and the box. I'll run it through the jointer to clean up and flatten one face and one edge, and then I can run it through the bandsaw. The frame is going to be 2.5 inches wide with a 1/2 inch tongue, so I'm rough cutting the first piece to be a little bit wider than 3 inches. The piece that's left over will be for the box sides. Then I'll slice it down the middle to be close to the thickness of the frame pieces. I'm cutting these to be just a little more than 1 inch thick. And then I'll adjust the fence to cut thinner pieces for the sides of the box. They only need to be about 1/2 inch for the final size, so I'm rough cutting these to be a little thicker than that. After making the first cut, I'll run it through the jointer to clean up the face and then make the second cut. These pieces are pretty close to the final thickness, so I'll skip using a planer and go directly to the drum sander to get them down to their final thickness. Next, I want to put a strip of maple to serve as edge banding around the perimeter of the frame, so I'm using my dado stack to cut a groove along the edge. I'll make one cut and then flip it around to cut again so that the groove is perfectly centered. Then I'll cut some strips of curly maple to the rough width and then run them through the drum sander to fit tightly into the grooves. The sandpaper was near the end of its life, so that's why the maple is coming out dark brown on the top. So I switched to a new roll and sanded some more. It was a pretty tight fit, which is exactly what I wanted so that no gaps appear. While the glue is curing, I will clean up the edge of the playing field. I want to take off the smallest amount possible so that the squares on the edges will remain as close to square as possible. Now I'll trim off the excess edge banding to get a nice clean edge. The frame is going to fit into the playing field with a tongue and groove fitting, so I'm cutting a groove that's about a ½ inch deep into the edges along 3 sides of each half of the playing field. Just like I did with the groove for the edge banding, I'm making a cut, then flipping the board around and cutting again so that the groove is centered. And now I'll cut the tongue into the frame pieces. Next, I'll switch blades to one that has a flat top grind so that I can cut a slot to hold the brass border. And then I'll set the brass next to the blade to set the height. I can cut a short way into the frame piece and test the fit. If it's not quite right, it's not a big deal because this part will be cut off when I cut the mitered corners. Next, I will sand the brass strips to make them adhere better, cut them to length, and then glue them in place. I'm using some Starbond medium thick CA glue that I apply to the wood, and then I spray some accelerator onto 2 sides of the brass.
After waiting about an hour for the CA glue to fully harden, I sand the frame pieces to remove the excess glue and to get the brass flush with the top of the frame. I do this by taking very light passes because if the brass gets too hot from the friction, it will cause the CA glue to release and the brass will pop off. Next, I cut the mating ends of the frame pieces to be square, and then I'll head to the table saw to cut the mitered corners. I'm going to use floating tenons to reinforce the miters, so I'm marking the locations of the tenons on each piece. I'm using a 1/4-inch spiral router bit to cut the mortises. And then I applied a liberal amount of glue, inserted the tenons, and clamped everything in place. The next day, I sanded everything flush. Then I made one final cut at the table saw to trim the short frame pieces to be flush with the edge of the playing field. Again, trying to remove the smallest amount of material possible so that the squares would remain as close to square as possible. Now I'm using a 12mm Forstner bit to drill recesses to hold the magnets along the edges of each half. And I'll also put magnets on the bottom side to hold the two halves of the board together when it's folded. Then I'll glue the magnets in place with some Starbond CA glue. I held each magnet down with the end of my pencil while I sprayed on the accelerator to make sure they were properly seated before the glue hardened. And the same thing for the edge magnets. I had to keep track of the polarity of each magnet to make sure that they were sitting in the correct direction so that they would attract each other. Now I'll start working on the box. I'm starting by lining up the grain and marking the lengths of each piece so that I cut them in the correct order. I used a stop block for cutting the pieces so that they would be consistent in length. In this case, consistency is more important than accuracy. I'll mark the top edge of each piece because this will be important when cutting the box joints. I'm using the Incra iBox jig, and I'll start by setting the height of the dado blade. I'm using a couple of off-cut pieces to test everything. I'll make the first cut on the scrap piece and then set the opening of the pins to fit snugly into the opening. After finishing the test, I'll clamp the pieces in place while I'm cutting them, and because these pieces are so narrow, it's easy for them to not be sitting perpendicular to the base of the jig, so I'm using a square to make sure they're seated properly. After making the last cut, I'll flip that board around and set it onto the pins to set the starting position of the adjoining piece. I use the markings on the top edge of each piece to keep track of how to put them into the jig, with the marking always nearest to the blade. Then I remove that piece and proceed with cutting the next piece. And it's a nice tight fit. Next, I'll use my router to cut a 1/4 inch groove along the bottom of the box sides to hold the bottom of the box. Unlike a mitered corner where I could cut the groove all the way through, I have to use stop blocks for the two end pieces so that the groove will not be visible from the outside of the box. I really need to rebuild my router table fence. This is one that my dad made for me more than 30 years ago, and some of the veneer on the particle board face has come off. For the bottom of the box, I'm using a piece of 1/4 inch hardboard that was used to package something that I received in the mail. This is a true 1/4 inch thick, so it will fit perfectly into the groove. Now I'll glue everything up and clamp it with sufficient pressure to ensure that the box joint closes up. The ends of the box joint are protruding just a bit, so I will sand them off. Despite using my square and clamping the pieces when I cut the box joints, this one had a small gap. So I'll use the glue and sawdust trick to conceal that. Now I'll run the top edges and the corners along a 16th inch roundover bit so that they're not too sharp. I applied the first coat of finish, but while doing that, I realized I had forgotten to put a chamfer on the bottom edge of the box. So, back at the router table, I'll put a 45-degree chamfer along the bottom to make the box easier to pick up. Now I'll spray on a coat of finish on the bottom. Next, I want to flock the interior of the box, but I'll leave about an inch at the top without any flocking, so I'm applying painter's tape so that I don't put any adhesive there. I'm going to use black flocking powder, so I'm applying black adhesive. You always want the color of the adhesive to match the color of the powder. I applied the flocking powder as soon as I had applied the adhesive. I removed the tape while the adhesive was still wet, and then I let it sit for 24 hours for the adhesive to dry. The next day, I vacuumed out the excess flocking powder and then carefully trimmed the edges wherever the line was not clean. Next, I'll use that 16th inch roundover bit to ease all of the edges of the chessboard, and then I'll sand it a bit by hand. You can see that I added a few more magnets because I didn't think it had a strong enough force of attraction. Then with my laser, I engraved the client's son's birth date into the bottom. And then a few coats of pre-catalyzed lacquer to finish up the board. So I gotta ask, would you make it?
Your dad's been working out.
Weighs 3,000.
It is pretty heavy, actually.
Yeah.
How does this open?
Big stretch there. Big stretch.
Oh. Big chess?
It is a custom board by Mike McCrory.
Goodness.
In fact, your birthday is on here. And Mike made this custom for you based off of. Wow. So the idea is that it's based off of the same design, right? But this one's a family heirloom.
That's really cool.
It's held together by magnets. You know, what I always loved about my grandfather's board is that there's such incredible sentimental value to it, but it's like a cheap board, right? Having him create something for you that really can be a family heirloom that's passed down, you know, or whatever, like just a part of, like, I think it would be pretty cool, right?
Yeah. Wow. That's incredible. It's really beautiful too.
Yeah, it's regulation size.
There you go.